Donald from Front and Central. On Friday afternoon, December 4th, myself and Abby Crick, a fellow member of the Front Street Writers class, had the opportunity to sit down and talk with 4 Traverse City area writers. In the studios, we had Mardi Link, Fleda Brown, Bob Downs, and Elizabeth Buzzelli. These 4 writers, along with many others, will be taking part in the first Traverse City Local Author Expo at the Inside Out Gallery on Saturday, December 19th from noon to 5:30 p.m. Admission is free to the public if you want to join us. What follows is some honest talk about the art and business of writing. If you have or have ever had the aspiration to be a writer, I think you will enjoy So You Want to Be a Writer. Welcome to So You Want to Be a Writer, a discussion about writing in the Front and Central studios at Traverse City Central High School. I'm Michaela O'Donnell.
And I'm Abby Crick. We have 4 of these local authors joining us today to talk about writing. Here are Mardi Link, Fleda Brown, Bob Downs, and Elizabeth Buzzelli.
So let's just get started. So what genre do you typically write in?
I'm a novelist.
Okay.
Well, I've written 2 travel books about backpacking around the world. I've been to 70 different countries. I wrote Planet Backpacker and then Travels with My Wife. Also wrote a book called Biking Northern Michigan, which is a guide to Northern Michigan. So I'd have to say my genre is nonfiction.
All right, so outdoors.
Adventure.
I'm mostly a poet. I've written a lot of books of poems and I've written some essays, but I'm here to represent the underrepresented genre of poetry.
And I write nonfiction. I've written both true crime and memoir, which are very different and sort of give me the opportunity to express myself broadly, but still be in nonfiction.
What triggered that flip? That's pretty big, from nonfiction to true crime.
It is, I know, and certainly in my memoir, nobody got harmed, physically harmed. I think that I had something to say. You know, I had been a reporter and I was mostly reporting on other people's misdeeds, and then I had a really interesting, challenging year. And so my own life provided material that really hadn't been there before. So that's what happened.
And you got kind of coerced into that by your agent, right?
I did get coerced into that,
Yeah.
yes. I was looking for an agent for a true crime book, and she happened to see an essay that I had written that was a personal essay about my own life, and she said, forget the true crime, I want a book about that.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And you were a reporter, and I believe you were a reporter too.
Yes.
So what's really the difference between writing in fiction versus news reporting?
Fiction's much harder. Oh my God, fiction takes me. Right now I'm writing fast, but mostly it takes at least a year or 2 to get a book done. And the reporting, it has to be fast. You've got to get it on your editor's desk by that afternoon. So you can't take the time. But if you don't take the time when you're writing fiction, you're not going to write good fiction. You're going to just write whatever comes out of your head. And whatever comes out of your head, whatever story that is, that's only the beginning. From there, it's draft after draft, and then edits after edits. I don't want anybody to think it's an easy thing to do. It isn't.
Right. You talk about draft after draft and edit after edit. Do any of you have a specific process that you use, or do you
just
do
keep
so many
working
edits,
until
or?
it's perfect. And you don't kid yourself. When you get tired, you say, oh, this is fine, and it's still a piece of garbage. You can't do that. You're going to keep going back and going back, because if you don't, your copy editor, the first editor, somebody in the publishing house is going to catch it, and then you're going to be embarrassed because you have to face it there that you've been a sloth and you didn't do the job you should have done.
I think one of the first things you have to do in the process of any kind of writing, but I'm thinking particularly poetry, I guess, is really study the people who do that work very, very well. You have to know the context of your own work. You have to know the people who've done that wonderfully in the past. You need to know who's doing it now, but particularly you need to understand your craft. You need to understand the whole context of your craft. And as far as process goes, when I sit down to write, I usually read a few poems by somebody I respect and admire first as a way. It's kind of like a tuning fork. Okay, ding, there's the level. That's the kind of thing that I want to have in my head as I start work. I started writing with a legal pad and pen, and I still do some of that, but it's gotten so that more and more I move to the computer faster and faster.
Right.
So, and of course, draft after draft after draft. I always think it's wonderful the minute I get a first draft, and 30
Because
minutes
then you
later.
have something to work with.
Right.
Then
It
there's
is
something there.
Fantastic, right? But I think it's wonderful. Then 30 minutes later, an hour later, the next day, I realize.
Or you wait for a week or so, and it just degrades every day, and you're ashamed of yourself. You've got to get back in there. Emily Dickinson once said she knew a fine poem when she could feel the top of her head fly off as she read. That's how I feel when I get good prose, when I'm reading a wonderful book. I can't even get through the book. I have to stop and start writing my own because you're inspired. How do you feel? What do you go for?
Well, for me, the writing is actually the easy part. I also do maybe, I think I'm on my 6th draft of a novel I'm writing. For me, the difficult part is marketing the book, because there are 4,500 books published every day of the week. The average literary agent gets more than 500 queries every single week. No, so and when you have a book published, your book may be one lone book in a bookstore with 600,000 titles. So the challenge for writers and poets is to have their book discovered and purchased. And that's partly what this expo is about. We're trying to raise the profile of authors, illustrators, and poets here in Traverse City and make this a book center of Michigan, just as it is a music center and a food center.
I take your point about marketing being difficult because there's so much chatter and there's so much noise.
Mm-hmm.
But if you spend the time to create the absolute best book that you can write, it's a lot easier to market quality and something that you feel proud of inside, or maybe not necessarily proud, but connected to, and that it's finished, than it is to just try and market something that really doesn't have value.
Right, I'd like to just add to that. Another challenge we face with books is that there's a diminished amount of time that the average person has for books now. They're locked up with Facebook, Netflix, all these different competing media sources for their time, and so that's another aspect that we have to worry about.
Talking about marketing and poetry is like talking about fish and aardvarks. Poetry is just a whole different animal. Marketing it's the last thing most poets think about, because to begin with, it has no share of the market. How many people can tell you who was the last bestseller poet? There are one or two, but basically you don't ever expect to make any money. You don't do this work in order to make money, and you really hope people read your poems. You really hope you sell some books. But if that doesn't enter into the initial picture for most poets, because we all know that it's going to be something that we're not going to make any money doing, and that we're never going to be in the front shelf of a bookstore unless it's a bookstore that's particularly in love with poetry. And so it changes the game completely, I think. It makes it much more about exactly what you were saying, Marty, only in a slightly different way. It really is, can I write poems that come up to the quality of the people whose work I admire and respect? And beyond that, you can hope for the best. Even the whole process of marketing is different, and that there's not time enough to go into that here, but you don't go to an agent and say, very few poets do that. You don't go to an agent and say, let's market my poetry. You either send it to the few people, the presses that publish poetry, or there are contests that you can enter. 1,000 manuscripts come in and one gets chosen. That's the way poetry gets marketed.
I'd just like to point out, though, that poetry, the popularity of poetry is cyclical. In the 1800s, The Song of Hiawatha and the Raven by Edgar Allan Poe were huge bestsellers. In the 1960s, the poems of Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti were huge bestsellers. Charles Bukowski, and then the poetry slams of the 90s. So I think poetry has its rise and fall in popularity, and I wouldn't discount that it can be popular on a mass scale.
I think when you mention those people, all of those people were writing poetry that's very public kind of poetry. And that's another distinction that we can make. Poetry that's intended to be extremely public rather than reflecting a lot of interior perspective. So it's not like it's two different poetries, it's two different angles.
How do you justify that though? Like knowing that you're probably not going to make a living off of poetry, knowing that there are thousands and thousands of books published a week, can you make a living off of writing? Do you balance it with other jobs?
I don't think you should go into this thinking you're going to make a living. If you're good enough, first you're going to get an agent, and then that agent's going to find you a good solid publisher. The solid publishers have a whole publicity department. Makes it a lot easier for you, but it's really hard. You better have another job when you start out. I wouldn't expect to live off writing novels or just about anything right now, because it's just a very difficult time, and the whole business itself is in such flux. My agent now is going into some self-publishing or helping some self-publish. So many of the publishing houses, have their own self-publishing lines. This is a very different animal than it used to be. It used to be a gentleman's game, and it isn't anymore. Well, thank God for that.
I've made my living solely as a writer since 2008, and I have yet to have a secure year. And initially that's really frightening, especially since I have kids in college. I'm a mom, and I have a mortgage and bills just like everybody else. But I've recognized that that's just part of my life now. That unsureness, that almost insecurity is just part of my life. It's not anything to be too worried about. I have to be concerned about it. But I've learned to diversify, and so I speak, and I get paid to do that. I do workshops. I get paid to do that. Sometimes I edit other people's books and get paid to do that. And in between that is time for my own writing and writing my own books. And I've been able to eke out a living. But that's what I've chosen. If I worked in corporate America, I'd probably add a zero to what I make every year. But I don't choose to do that. So you just have to know that when you go into it, that is your life. The insecurity for 99.9% of writers who make their living doing this, there is an insecurity component, and you have to learn how to live with that.
And you have to love what you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
Anything in the arts, you don't go into it for the money. You
Yeah.
go into it because you can't do anything else. And
And
do
now
it
I've
as well.
become unemployable because I simply couldn't work for anybody else but myself. I'm quite the taskmaster.
It's kind of like being a musician, it's something you love so much to do, but you're not necessarily going to hit that really big time. And I'm like you, I also do speaking engagements around the state and digital video shows. So I think, though, just getting back to poetry, one group of poets who have made it very rich are the hip-hop and rap artists. So,
Yeah. I think that's kind of where poetry is going. Now it's just becoming song lyrics. And I think that business is booming. It's getting bigger, and as we're getting into technology, I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. But I mean, just seeing all the differences that come from lyrics and what actual poetry are, like when you read it from a book, I think it's really interesting just to see the differences and how it's displayed.
Very different, right.
I think what's disturbing to me about that is, and I listen to some hip hop music, is the subject matter. Can be disturbing to people who enjoy reading more traditional poetry, more in keeping with print poetry. A lot of the modern focus of musical poetry is money.
Well, what you're saying about musical poetry is important. Once the words get combined with the lyrics, and I've written some librettos for small opera things, then the words have to get thinner. They have to get more repetitive. A lot of things have to change, and I say have to change like that makes it worse. It's a whole different thing, really. It becomes a performance thing with music and with words, and that's what it is. It's a performance thing. But poetry, what I'm talking about, poetry on the page, which then gets read, but it's poetry on the page, tends to be much more dense, much richer with the language. The tradition is different for that. And as far as supporting yourself, I think, poets used to have patrons. They used to have rich people who supported them. Yeah, right. Where did they go? Fortunately for me, and I just feel so grateful that this is true, I had a university as my patron, which a lot of poets come out of a university system, and that means that you have a job, you have money, and at the same time you're encouraged to do your work, your craft, because you've got the support of your institution behind you.
Speaking of craft, what are one of your habits that you do just when you work your craft? What are those things that you don't really think other writers do, or other people for that matter who don't write?
I think I don't think it's a quirk, because I know there are some other writers that do it, but it goes into that revision conversation that we had. Some writers can do a first draft that they're not totally attached to. They just want to get it down on paper, and then they'll go back and fix it. So they get it down, and then they fix it up. That's how some writers work. I wish I could work like that. I can't. If there's a wrong word, if there's an off paragraph, if the first line is not engaging, I have to pick apart that page until, it doesn't have to be perfect for me to go on, because I know it will never be, but it has to be something that I can go to sleep at night and say, okay, if I had a heart attack tonight and died and they saw what I wrote, I wouldn't be embarrassed.
You know the story about the novelist Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary, that his friends asked him one morning if he'd go on a day-long hike or something, and they all got together, and he said, no, I can't, I've got to write, I've got to work, and because that's just the way he was. And so they were gone all day, and they came back, and they said, well, how was your day? And he said, I had a wonderful day, the most productive day. He said, at the beginning of the day, I put in a colon, and at the end of the day, I took it out.
I don't think I'm quite that bad. But I can't move ahead with something unless it's pretty... not finished, but it's pretty much on its way. And that makes it much more difficult at the beginning, but then at the end, when you do go back for a full revision, it's not quite as involved.
I'm definitely the writer who just gets the words out on the page to make sure that I have it. I have some inkling of an idea. Maybe I'll go back the next day and just annotate the whole thing so I know where to be. But I'm the one who just lays all the words out just to make sure I have at least some kind of little structure, so when I go back, I can just start filling stuff in.
I think writers generally are one or the other. I really think that writers are one or the other.
I haven't found my place yet then. Each book is different. Mm-hmm. The one I'm working on now suddenly is requiring me to go back and absolutely know what's in that first paragraph or the first chapter, and from there I'm watching my themes, I'm watching where I'm introducing characters. I've never been this orderly before on any of the books I've done. So I guess I have no specific ideas about how to do it. You just get busy. But the thing I tell my students is that first paragraph, if you screw up the first paragraph, you've lost your audience. That has got to be the most interesting, exciting thing you've ever written in your life. And if you've got that right, well, just keep going. You can always come back and fix the rest.
That's really great advice.
When you are under deadline and all of this pressure, where do you find inspiration for poetry or for nonfiction or fiction or crime dramas? Where do you go to for that?
I was editor of Northern Express for more than 20 years, and so we had deadlines every week. And it wasn't like you had time to be inspired. You just opened a vein and let it flow. You know, it had to get done. And to me, when you're writing a book, if you need inspiration, it's already dead in the water. You're already alive with excitement about that book, and you can't wait to sit there and write it. So I don't really need inspiration so much as I just need to, you know, get going with it, you know.
Right. So where do you find that excitement? Do you just have to wait for something to catch your eye and then?
Well, in my travel books, I sort of got my original inspiration from authors such as Jack London, Norman Mailer, people who went out and had adventures and then wrote about them. That was the old traditional author route. And so that's what I did with my books about backpacking around the world. Now I'm writing a book about the Ojibwe Indians of 400 years ago, and it is a novel. I've just always been interested in the Indians, and so I've been very involved with that for the last year.
As a writer, do you think that you kind of just see things like in multiple dimensions? Like you're seeing something for yourself, but you're also seeing this, and anyone else can respond to this, but see this in a different light each single time? Like there's layers of you seeing things? Like one time you're seeing this for a book, and one time you're seeing it for yourself, and one time you're seeing it on the paper.
Well, I certainly think that makes a book interesting if you've got multidimensional characters and plots, subplots and such. I think that maybe the other authors would have a better handle on that.
I always start with an image. To me, writing is very visual. I mean, I'm seeing, I don't want to say a movie because that's too flat for what I see when I'm writing, but I'm seeing things happen while I'm writing about them, even if it's research or a news story or a personal essay. And I hope that comes across in the finished work. I hope it feels visual when people, when people read it. So I do. I would say yes, I see I see things.
Me too.
Yeah.
I start with the image.
Yes.
I'm very visual, just extremely. I remember images long after I've forgotten everything else. And so I'm grabbing for that image. And once I have something, then it's a matter of sinking deep enough into the image that it's pulling up other things and other things and other things, sometimes totally unrelated, but I find, if I keep playing with it, I see how it can work together.
That's how you find a larger platform, a larger canvas, just by seeing it. I can't write something that I haven't visualized and walked through. I want to know what's in a corner here and there, and I want to know these characters off stage. I want to know about them. And the only way you can do that is just let yourself go. I drive. I just go out and get in the car and just drive. And my head is going like mad, and I hurry home because I've got that image. I've got the perfect place, and they're doing the right things, and they're saying the right words, and I just have to get home fast enough. So watch out for me on the road.
Yeah, I think it almost gets a little scary because you start living in that world.
You
and
do.
You think, am I going crazy?
No, never crazy. It's the other people.
The advice that I always have for people who say, I want to be a writer, the topic that we're talking about is, it's sort of counterintuitive because first I tell people read. Be a reader. Don't ever think that you can be a writer without being an avid reader. But then on the other hand, don't try and sound like someone else. Don't try and sound like your favorite author. You will have turned the corner when you sound like you. When you sit down to write and you write that first sentence or you write that first page and it's only you could have written it. So write something only you could write, but then read a lot of other writers.
On the other hand, I have with students many times asked them to deliberately write exactly like another poet. To follow the pattern and the sentence structure, everything of another writer as practice, I think. Because anything you do that you bump up against a problem that doesn't feel like you helps you kind of stretch. So yeah, I think maybe for a poet the only way you get to sound like you is to keep bumping up against obstacles.
Yeah.
You either have a form you're bumping up against or you have language you're bumping up against, something.